Benji, can you pray for us before we start?
Well, Lord, I thank you for the privilege and, Lord, the opportunity for, Lord, fellowship with one another and for the opportunity to meet, Lord, tonight. Lord, I just thank you for each way that you, Lord, teach and seek to, Lord, grow your sons in your ways. I pray that you would continue to, Lord, open up our hearts and minds and, Lord, our understanding and what it means to be a son, Lord, and what and how these things can be applied to our own lives, Lord. And Lord, I pray that this time would just continue to be, Lord, of honor to your name, and that we wouldn't get caught up in, Lord, our own mindsets or thoughts, Lord, but be guided by your Spirit, Lord, in the conversation and, Lord, in the questions. Just continue to pray that you would, Lord, help us to be rid of, Lord, the things that come to distract, and Lord, we try to oppose your work in our midst. Lord, would you quiet our hearts and minds now for this time? In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. All right. Glad y'all are here. Let's go ahead and get through the questions for chapter 6. Hopefully you guys went through those beforehand.
Of course.
And yeah, I guess we can take turns on each question. And if you guys have additional thoughts that maybe stem from but go beyond the question too, this time is for you guys to speak. So if you're ready to do that. I guess the first question here is the review questions. How would you compare the life of a spiritual man with that of a natural man?
I think one of the biggest things, in that we talked about it before in past times, but it's the lack of having, authority over your life. A spiritual man is guided by something other than himself, and the natural man kind of has to find things on his own. I feel like things are not brought to him by a greater authority, I guess.
Like an orphan versus a son.
Pretty much. Yeah.
So, do you have additional thoughts to that and the way Benji's approaching it, Isaac?
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, as Benji said, the natural man is about his own way, and obviously that's self-centered, and it's based on self, for self, seeking self.
Essentially what he's saying is the spiritual man is the enlightened man, because the enlightened man is the man that realizes that his life is not his own. But the natural man is the ignoramus, the ignorant man, that's what that means.
Okay.
Which is to say that he's blinded and thinks that his life is his own, even though it's not. And so there is enlightenment means that you carry a knowledge with you about something that brings an awareness of a new reality to you. And the reason that the spiritual man has that enlightenment is because he does, as you were saying, Benji, have not just a recognition of an authority in his life, but a even a relationship with that authority.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that way it's something that is it's governed in his life by love. So as I think we've discussed in many different places and with different people, authority is often something understood in a negative connotation by us because of the many negative examples it has throughout history. But there is a right model for authority, and God, of course, is the supreme authority, and everything that he does is good. It can't be not good. And so these are things that the spiritual man, again, doesn't just know, but lives as a reality.
Yeah, I also think it's like you were saying with like authority. It's like the natural man. It seems better to most people at surface level because it's a life that is seemingly more fulfilling and more fun and more enjoyable. But I think you find out really quick how empty it is and that it lacks purpose, because your only purpose and all that you're seeking is self-gratification, that you can never be satisfied that way, and you're left feeling empty very quick and very often. And obviously, life with the spiritual man is seeking a purpose that is greater than yourself.
Right.
And obviously not for yourself. You're realizing that your life is not your own.
Yeah, as a part of that awareness, there is a recognition that your life is very small, but it's also a part of something very big. Well, that doesn't even really register in the mind of the natural man, because the life is governed by the senses, and so things that are and should be understood to be very small and insignificant are emphasized a little too much, which that is speaking of the earthly and temporal realm. And while of course those are things that we don't disregard, living as a spiritual people, they're not the things that govern the way that we live. They're not the things that drive our pursuit in life. They're not the center of all things.
Yeah, I think when you're living the life of a natural man, you're almost living in 2D.
Yeah, put it in a dimensional understanding is good, yeah.
I think when you start to live in spiritual understanding and enlightenment and vision, you kind of open up to a new dimension, because at that point you're living life in more of a 3D, because you can see more, like even literally in life when you live as a spiritual man, because there's a whole new realm opened up to you rather than just earth, and that has everything to do with the flesh. And because it's when you realize that there's not just a soul inside you, that there's a spirit inside you. There's something else than your organs and heart and brain. There's something, a whole other living entity inside you and entities around you. So.
Yeah, that's a pretty good example. Can you guys expound yourselves using that example between the 2D and the 3D? What other comparisons can be drawn between the natural man and the spiritual man using that illustration?
Yeah. I think being a natural man, almost the Lord even places like a potential to be something more than just a natural man.
Right.
And, a spiritual man is one who is basically, I don't even know how to say it, but that has fulfilled that potential, I guess.
Let's try to think, too,
yeah,
how things look to a man that lives in the 2D when he witnesses something that is 3D. How does that look to him? Have you guys ever seen those videos before that illustrates what a 3D object would look like in a 2D world? Hopefully this won't be too confusing, but it's like putting a 3D shape through a 2D plane. Okay, so you just have this flat plane, and then you put like a circle through it. The image that will show up on the plane will start out as a small circle, and then get big as the sphere passes through it, and then back like this. You can imagine that, right?
Mm.
That's what the people in 2D would see. If a 3D object came into the 2D world, it would like start out, if it was a sphere, for instance, it would start as a small point and then expand into a wide circle if it got to finally the full circumference of that circle, and it would disappear again to a small circle again as that 3D object passed through the 2D world. Which is to say that it would be some pretty crazy, bizarre, seemingly impossible scenario for people in a 2D world to witness.
And
But,
to understand, right?
And to understand, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically impossible. They can't explain it.
Yeah.
But now look at things from the 3D individual's perspective. How do they experience things?
And how do they even look at people living in the 2D?
They look at them just like we see people in a video game, basically. They're just kind of
They're almost
limited
looking through a
into
keyhole.
Right.
There's something they're missing.
Yeah. So that's why we can refer to 3D in comparison to 2D as a higher dimension, because they are able to operate and understand in both, but they are not governed by the lesser dimension. They operate in the higher dimension, the 3D. And so I appreciate you bringing that example up, because it is a really interesting way, a really helpful way to understand what it means to live in a spiritual reality and as a spiritual man compared to a natural man. And at first glance, perhaps those two different men can't be told apart, but it's when you come to know one or the other that you can really see, wow, this man operates according to a completely different reality than most men, natural men. He's drawing life from somewhere that's not of this world. Okay, how about the next question? Number 2. What are your natural senses? Do you think they're comparable to your spiritual senses? If so, in what way? Spiritual senses, natural senses. It's not too different from the first question. We're just kind of narrowing in on
narrowing in a little bit.
How they experience reality. They're different realities.
True. I guess using the example of being able to see in 3D and operating in that mode, you're gonna be more sensitive to the way that God is moving and speaking through His people, and I mean, that is pretty a general thing, but you're definitely going to be, I guess, more spiritually sensitive to the way that He's moving, and living in that 3D realm, you're able to see you're able to, I guess, quiet your mind and kind of posture your heart so it's in a position to receive that kind of way, which, and then I guess in a 2D form, that's not even something that's on the map. That's not even something that you're thinking about or even care about at all.
You guys think?
When we look at the first question, what are your natural senses? I mean, we know that. We have the, what was it, 5 senses? And then we can... It is similar to the first question because we can choose to be governed by our 5 senses or choose to be governed by, you know, the spirit, because I think that's the difference. Because it's basically choosing which realm we're going to be governed by. We're going to be governed by the 2D realm, or live in the 2D realm, or live in the 3D realm. And I think that's the do you think they are comparable to? I think natural senses and spiritual senses do work together because you're the same person at the end of the day. So I think your senses are going to, you know, work. I'm trying to explain this because so to start over a little bit, you have your senses, but you can basically choose how you're going to govern those senses depending on, you know, what realm you're living by. Because I think your senses can be controlled by the spirit, or they can be controlled by your soul. So
Yeah, I think to that point a little bit, I almost feel like your natural senses can also work against your spiritual sense in a way.
Yeah.
Because it's a lot of the time, I mean, that's all that the natural man has to rely on is those senses. And again, when you're living in a 2D world and you see something that doesn't make sense, like something in 3D, it doesn't apply to your natural senses. It doesn't make sense. You can't comprehend it, and therefore, obviously, it's just going to seem completely wacky and nonsensical and insane. It's not even something you're going to look into, which is when that level of faith comes in, Drew. You have to almost look beyond your natural senses and say, this isn't going to be tangible, but how can I learn from this?
Yeah, I think you guys have some good points, and I think it was even talking about it in the chapter, how the Lord uses the natural things to teach us about the spiritual things, and how to understand them through the natural things, because there's a purpose in the way that He designed humans, and relating our senses. I think I'm not sure you can say it too, but maybe it's more of just I don't think it's like a physical, I think there's a tangible sense to it, like you were saying, but it's not like it's something that can be understood as senses are understood, in the way that they operate, but
well, yeah, from the very beginning of this chapter, it was talking about how we can use the natural life as a way to even allegorically understand the spiritual life, just as a natural process of a young child being grown into a mature adult, or a young sproutling growing into a mature tree, so too can we use the example of natural senses to give us an idea of how spiritual senses work. Of course, we have to understand they are certainly different.
Yeah.
This reminds me of when Jesus was, after he had shared the parable of the sower in Matthew 13, and he quoted chapter 6 of Isaiah. You guys might recognize this. But the disciples had come to Jesus asking why he spoke to people in these dark sayings or in these parables. So that's something that Jesus would often do, drive some people crazy because he couldn't really grasp his meaning, because they were still in the natural way of understanding things. They were still using their senses, quote unquote. And Jesus replied to them saying, "The knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For the people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them." So what do you think about what Jesus said there in the context of the discussion? Obviously, when he's talking about seeing with those eyes and hearing with those ears, he's not talking about natural eyes and ears, right?
Yeah, I mean, he puts it in such a way that it's, I mean, again, going back to that example, it's very much we're in a 2D dimension.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to sit here and try to explain something to you in 3D. You're going to think it's crazy, and you're not going to understand. You're going to hear it, it's going to go right through you, and it's not going to be something that is going to mean anything. So
Right.
He's putting it in such a way to where we can actually understand it, and it's kind of a pathway into actually understanding what he means by the parable. And it gives you something tangible to kind of grasp onto, and then say, well, I want to know more, I want to know what this actually means.
Right. Essentially what you're saying is spiritual life requires spiritual reception. Spiritual words require spiritual ears. I mean, if you're going to speak in a language, the receiver has to understand that language, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so those who pretend that they can receive things from a language they don't even understand are naturally going to misunderstand the language and give people a false representation or account of what is truth. That's where the pride and presumption of man comes in, his attempt to intellectually process something that is meant to be spiritually processed. Mm-hmm. That will always lead to misleading and confusion and counterfeit. There's a lot of really good points that can be made here about the way that our or the necessity of our spiritual eyes to be open and our spiritual ears to be open so that we can truly see and hear the truth and the consequences of not doing so. All right. Let's go ahead to the third question. Why did Jesus warn of the disciples of yeast in the bread? That will require us to go back a page to the verses he shares there under the heading Spiritual Food and Growth. So I'll read for us here in Matthew 16, 5 through 12. It says, "When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. 'Be careful,' Jesus said to them. 'Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees.' They discussed this among themselves and said, 'It is because we didn't bring any bread.' Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, 'You have little faith. Why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000, and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000, and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? But be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees.' Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees." What does that mean?
It's saying the teaching is the yeast, and obviously yeast fluffs up the bread, right? And so I guess it's maybe their teachings seem good on the outside and they appeal to the natural man, but they're hollow. They don't have really anything backing them up, and they introduce dangerous mindsets, basically, in that they really don't tie back to anything. They're meaningless.
Exactly.
They look good, but they're nothing. They're just fluff. And it's also kind of, you have to be careful for that, because it's very easy, because it appeals to our natural man, it's very easy to want to strive and go after that, but it's a dangerous path. And so it can slip in there very easily, so you have to be careful and call that out.
Exactly, yeah. What do you guys think?
I think you described it well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like Isaac said, if you think about what yeast does, it's almost like it like inflates the bread. It's like an infection inside the dough. It does something. It almost corrupts the bread because of what it does to it, and makes it like freak out. So I don't, like, if you think about the process of yeast, it's not something that's like peaceful. Why is that funny?
That's the way you worded it. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think like you said, I think I explained that pretty well. I don't know if there's a lot more to expound on that specifically, because like it's like use it in a real sense. It's like letting your mind be influenced by something. It's like the yeast in your mind or your spirit or your soul is like the dough, and like that kind of teaching and even false teaching stuff is like yeast. It's gonna puff you up.
Yeah, and it's appealing, and it feels good, and it looks good for sure, and it leads to nothing.
Yeah, I think you guys expounded on that pretty well.
Garbage.
Yeah, it's right under the sink there. we can go ahead and move on to the next question.
Meditation and application.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh. My lights are still on. Hold up.
Oh.
How did you not see that?
I think this next question is referring to like the, it's like a baby versus like a spiritual baby, like the stages of growth. I think we talked about that a good amount last week too.
Yeah, it'll be a good chance for us to review that a little bit and maybe
Yeah.
share additional thoughts about it too.
Sorry.
It's alright. So the question is, what are the stages of the growth of a natural man? Do you think that they are applicable to our spiritual growth? If so, in what way? So again, we're taking an example of something we are very familiar with. It's a common natural process of human development and applying it to spiritual maturity. We don't have to overcomplicate it, we just...
Yeah. I think that this does kind of fit in with the parable thing, because it's, I think when you're, I guess in a sense, a spiritual baby, you're going to need spiritual milk in the sense that it's maybe something that is easier to understand, like as we used like in the example of parables. You're maybe not necessarily ready for like full on food yet, like adult food. And so, I mean, that's one way that you could take the example, but I know there's also a lot of other ways.
Think of not even just the physical aspects of that development, but what goes on in even the mental capacity of a child and how that can compare to spiritual development.
It's if you try to like give a little baby like a full course meal, that's not gonna go very well.
Yeah.
But it needs something that adheres to what they're ready for.
It's a gradual growth. So the more mature they are, the more they can be fed. And that doesn't.
I think there's 3 main capacities worth emphasizing for both natural and spiritual. The first is, which we're touching on most here, is more of a physical capacity, at least when we're talking about the natural man.
Yeah.
Of course, that has parallels with the maturity of the spirit man, even though it doesn't have to do with the physical. The second is capacity for knowledge. So in the case of the natural man, that will have to do with his ability to process information and understand the world around him. And so we'll try to see how that fits with the description of the spirit man. And the third is relational capacity. That's also something that matures in both. So I think we've covered the first one enough. Talking about, for instance, what a young child is able to consume or compared to what he's able to consume when he matures. But then how does this compare to like his ability to receive wisdom and understanding?
Yeah,
When he grows in the spirit.
that's actually a good way to think about it. It's kind of like what in your natural man is going to grow because you're growing spiritually, and how they're going to both almost grow together, but only because you're seeking that and you're growing spiritually.
Mm.
Yeah. Kind of like what I was mentioning earlier, just, how the Lord designed things in a certain way so that we could learn from it and, see it in a light that we can actually understand.
Mm.
And that whole process of, from a baby to a man is, there's a lot in between. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. I do definitely think that it's applicable to spiritual growth. You can
I want
see those different things.
focus a little bit more on the relational part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So think about a person's relationships as they progress through life and how those relationships change, not in just the way that the person makes new relationships as he grows, and has the capacity to have certain relationships when he matures to certain points in life, but even the relationships that he begins with, his very first relationships, obviously for every person that's his parents, his father and mother, even those relationships change through time. Even though they're the first relationships he had, even those relationships evolve as he matures as a person. How can that apply spiritually?
Well, I think when people are growing spiritually, even if they've had past experience in Christianity or none at all, it's just like it's first knowing like who your father is, even your father in heaven, or even if you knew you had a father in heaven if you're a Christian, but actually understanding that relationship a little more. Kind of to Dad's example, he tells about his own life where God told him that he knows a lot about him, but he doesn't actually know him. So I think that's a big thing. And spiritual growth is actually understanding that part of intimacy with God. So I think it applies to what we were talking about earlier about the dimensions. That's also spiritual growth, I think. It's even coming to that realization. So
Just think of the relationship with your own father and how that has changed since when you were just a toddler, and how you were nourished by that relationship and what your interest was in that relationship compared to what nourishes you now in that relationship with your father, and what interests you now that you've reached a new stage of maturity. Obviously, you know your father as a person a lot more than you did when you were just a little baby. But with that knowledge has come a difference in the way that you relate to your father and even interact with him. How could that apply to God's children, new believers, essentially babies in the faith, and what that maturity brings in their relationship to God?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a...
What is the emphasis of a new believer if you're to think of them as spiritual babies? What is the emphasis in their understanding of who God is?
I think they're seeking for understanding for sure. I think that's they're obviously, we have a lot of questions And that's definitely something that we're looking for in that relationship, is very much guidance.
Yeah.
And to walk alongside him as his son. And I think as that matures and that relationship develops, you continue to dedicate more and more of your life to his will and his way, and spend more time with him in his way, to the point where that becomes your life and your only purpose. And so it takes on a new sense of sincerity, for sure, just as you continue to mature in that relationship, and that's going to change the fundamentals of everything in your life, and the way you operate, and the way you spend your time, and the way you relate with one another, and just the way that you operate as a person in general. It's going to change all of that as you continue to grow in that relationship with him.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. The central focus, it seems, of that stage of development, whether naturally or spiritually, is it's a little more self-centered, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you're a baby, the world revolves around you pretty much. And when you want something, you'll kind of whine and complain until you get it, or you're pacified in some way. And there's a lot of tolerance on those who are responsible for your life, because you are young and immature, and that's understandable. But obviously the intent is not for you to remain as a baby, but to be raised to a point where you don't have to be obviously treated in that way anymore, but you take on more and more responsibility, first for your own life, being able to manage yourself, and then further down the road for other lives. And as a result, you come to really appreciate you come to appreciate your parents much more, because you first realize what they did for you, because you have the capacity to realize that. But then when you become a parent yourself and experience that, when you have your own children, there's a whole new level of realization and appreciation, because you're in their shoes at that point, because you've reached that level of maturity. So yeah, that's
a good thing. Is like, as you begin to mature, it just becomes less and less and less and less about yourself, and that's
right.
That's good. That's what you want.
Yep, that's 100% the case spiritually too. That's the example we're trying to draw here.
Mm-hmm.
Is it certainly does become, like you're saying, as less centered on your own life, even in the good things.
Yep.
It's even less centered on, am I maturing? Even that is not really the question that bugs you all the time, because maturity comes as a result of you going beyond yourself and laboring in other lives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thing. There's so many examples that we could draw from the growth of a natural man to the growth of a spiritual man. Could probably last us all night. And the point is not to exhaust our time together, but this, I say so to remind you that this example can always be returned to, and there's so many things that it can uncover and give us understanding on our growth in the Spirit. So I guess for now we'll move on to the next question.
This one's a toughie.
You think?
I don't know. For me, it was.
All right. Read the following parable and then explain what do you think Jesus meant in this verse in Matthew 13:33. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into a large amount of flour until it worked all through the dough.
I guess in this example, the yeast would be a good thing.
Not the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, obviously.
Yeah, it would be almost like the yeast is the good things of the Lord, and He is working it through His kingdom and His people all throughout His kingdom. I don't know. That would be my understanding. I could obviously expand on that. I don't even know if that's...
I think you're 100% right.
I think
What do you guys think?
Interesting to see that, like, usually the different examples. We can see that even the way the Sadducees wanted to impart teachings, maybe some of it wasn't even a wrong way, it's just what they were teaching that was wrong. And I think because we see here that the yeast is used as a good example because those things are the right things, and they are being, like in the example of the yeast, taught in a way that it's going to influence you and expand your maybe your spiritual capacity and your spiritual life. It's hard to explain that very well, but
No, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, it's like the...
Because... Go ahead.
It's like the same yeast that is meant to be worked into the dough, which is the kingdom of God, is almost taken and misconstrued by the Pharisees and Sadducees to where the point to where it's like a whole different thing. It's meant to be good and it's meant for good, but it's
They still operate
misunderstood.
kind of like we were touching on a little bit in our past discussion. They're still operating under the governance of the law of Moses.
yeah.
And as a part of being bound to that law, they were unable to reach the perfection of the law, which was not in following the law as they understood it, but in seeing that Jesus, as the Christ, was the fulfillment of that law, and by partaking of that life that He represented, like we were saying, that's how they could reach perfection in the very law that they operated under and lived under. But that's what they were unable to see, and see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts, so that the Lord could turn and heal them. They were completely... There was a veil, as Paul would later say, over their minds from understanding that truth. And go ahead, Benji, I want to hear your thoughts about this verse.
Yeah, kind of similar to what Isaac said, actually. Immediately, the impression of just the few simple words that were added into this verse, how the woman mixed it and worked it all throughout the dough. Almost like the big thing that Clay was, even just the way that the yeast is used, just simply the way, like, that's what I don't even know.
That's actually what I was gonna address in what Isaac had said, is what you said there is true, but it leads us to want to explore that statement a little further. You said that it's essentially the Lord working His ways into His people, or into His kingdom. But how does He choose to do that, is the question. And what can even this picture here of a woman mixing the yeast into a large amount of flour or into the dough. How can that picture give us more understanding of that way?
Yeah.
And I have an interesting understanding in that the woman is a picture of the church, basically of God's people, and obviously the part of her body that she's using to knead in the dough is her hands, right? And the hands, one might say, represent the 5 ministries of the church or of the Lord's people. I guess that's pastors, teachers, evangelists, prophets, and leaders, I think. Those are mentioned, I think, in Corinthians by Paul. And one can picture those ministries are what are working in culture into the dough. That's what the yeast is the culture. Mm-hmm. And she's not just putting it in to any kind of wheat. She's putting it into flour. That's an important thing to recognize. What does wheat have to go through to become flour? Has to undergo quite a process, right? In order for wheat to reach the state of being the substance of flour, it has to go through, firstly, the threshing, so the separation of the wheat from the tares, so the bad stuff that you don't want from, or maybe that's in the, that's in the threshing floor. Then it has to go undergo a process of cleansing, and then it has to undergo a process of grinding. It has to go through a lot of refining work in order to be a substance that can receive the yeast. Are you guys seeing what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So
that example goes really deep.
Yeah, there's a few different stages here. It requires separation from the counterfeit, which you guys may have heard the example of wheat and tares from another one of Jesus' parables. You can't actually take the tares up during the time that they're growing with the wheat, otherwise the wheat will be destroyed. You have to wait until the harvest, and then when they're brought to the threshing floor, then you can separate the wheat from the tares. The wheat to be brought into the storehouses later to be used as flour, and the tares to be burnt. They even have similar appearances too, which is why it definitely serves as a good example of counterfeit. But then, even the wheat, there's certain parts of the wheat that have to be removed. That can be thought of as, even though we are chosen by the Lord, there's still parts of ourselves that came along with the package that have to be removed and burnt away. And there's also the grinding process where we're made into what God desires us to be through the process of discipline or of discipleship. Is what that grinding could be symbolized as. And only then when we've been made into that substance of the flour, can the woman mix in through the ministries that culture of God, which can result in the finished product that can be baked to the loaf. So in that one little verse, there's quite a bit. There could be quite a bit, yeah. You guys have any more thoughts about it? All right. Quiet bunch.
Quiet bunch.
Let's go to question 3. Give consideration to the effect that food has on your physical health. Do you think these effects are applicable in principle to your spiritual health? If so, how? Here's another one of those natural spiritual comparisons. What do you guys think? Might be helpful to recall the saying, "You are what you eat."
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely the what you're eating is the way you spend your time, the people you spend your time with, and that very much influences the way that you think and the way that you operate. I definitely think that's unhealthy food versus healthy food. If you're partaking in things that are honoring to God, that is very much healthy food, and I think that results in you being spiritually fed by Him through doing things that honor Him. So that's definitely one way to look at it.
Yeah. And how certain foods, can excel the process of growth or decrease or decline in the
Yeah.
Yeah. And like you're saying, the stuff that you eat is what you are, and being discerning of what you're taking in as well is, I think, a big part of that growth, being able to even understand good from bad, or bad.
There are...
What?
I like that. It's just funny.
Sorry.
There's nothing that you just I just can't help laughing at him sometimes. It's again, Reggie. It's nothing that what we're kind of on what you're expounding on there. There's some, I guess you can call them laws of reality that govern natural and spiritual. And the one I have in mind is something we are all very familiar with, which is that which you sow, you will reap. Yeah. And that's kind of a different way of saying you are what you eat, but it's more of a general way of putting it. And to be aware of such laws give us the wisdom and insight to govern our lives wisely, or to go about our lives naturally and spiritually in a discerning way. And so, yes, we can stick with the example here of the food that we partake of naturally or spiritually having an effect on our spiritual or natural health. But this applies to everything in life. It applies to everything that we consume through every avenue possible. And the things that we do externally or internally. Our thoughts, our very thoughts, are seeds that we plant. Do you ever think about that? Every thought that we have is a seed planted, and that's going to bear fruit in some form or fashion.
Yeah.
Whether that fruit is in a recurrence of that thought, or through recurrent thoughts, planting seeds that will bear fruit in action. Those actions will come to plant more seeds that bear fruit in habit. And it all came from a single thought.
Yeah.
Your very life is governed by thoughts. That's why what goes on here and the way we discipline it is of vital importance. And the same thing, of course, applies spiritually. Not in a mutually exclusive way, as if these are two different... I mean, they are different, but as if they don't have any impact on each other. But the way that we discipline our thoughts, or as Paul would say, taking every thought captive, that's basically referring to a discipline of the mind, has an effect in both the spiritual and natural realm. What are your thoughts?
You think about it really practically too, because like, if you don't eat, you're not gonna live.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't feed your spiritual man, he's not really gonna live that well. You gotta take in consideration, even.
Yep, you'll weaken, and you can definitely deplete your spiritual man. You can become emaciated.
Yeah.
And
Like the example with Jesus, the disciples came to him and asked if he wanted food, and he said, well, doing the work of the Father is just food.
man does not live on bread alone.
Yeah.
There are some things that you learned and what even Derek Prince had shared. You think there's any relevance to what we're talking about there, Isaac? Any connections you can draw?
Yeah, I mean, he talked about very much where he gets his food from,
Mm-hmm.
his spiritual fruit, and one very practical thing that he had talked about was getting up every morning, and immediately first thing on his mind was listening to the Father and his ways and basically what the Lord has planned for him that day. And then he went on to list a bunch of things that started happening in his life that are very much good fruit that resulted in him simply just waking up with that in mind and going to bed with that in mind. And that is definitely, it's very much the things that he's feeding his spiritual man. He's reaping what he's sowing, and he's having good fruits because of what he decided to do, because of his willingness and passion to seek that.
Yeah. Something like that's always, those kind of things are always really encouraging to me.
Mm-hmm.
Just the simple things that you can do at the beginning and end of your day. And just, for instance, waking up in the morning and just asking the Lord, what do you have for me today? And certainly it can be a time you set aside for like meditation and wanting to hear from the Lord. Sometimes we don't always have that opportunity at that time of day, but at least to wake up with that being your first thought.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like an insignificant thing, because we tend not to really use the examples of other mornings where we wake up with some random thought about something and see that as determining our day anyway. So why would this determine the rest of our day? But there are some ways that the seeds we plant and the resulting fruit that we reap from those seeds, sometimes we don't always draw those connections and see that the way that we start our day may very well have impacted something else significantly that happened later on, or the attitude that we carried throughout the rest of that day.
Mm-hmm.
We don't always see the connections there. But even as Isaac was saying, Derek Prince's own testimony to how he would begin and end his days before the Lord bore tangible and traceable fruit throughout his day.
Yeah, I can even read some of
Especially when you build into a habit, yeah.
I can even read some of those fruits that he had talked about.
Yeah.
Some of the things, words of encouragement for others. So it had given him some obviously very, I guess, encouraging words to say to other people that he's in relation with. And then personal direction for that day, kind of just leading him and seeing what the Lord wants him to do with that day. He got answers for that. And then there was personal obedience to that, was also a result of that, is him actually hearing the Lord and obeying his commands. And then also personal strength and personal determination to follow that and to seek that even harder than he had ever done before. And not only the determination, but the strength to also continue to seek that. Those are just some of the things that he had mentioned.
That's something I myself really want to get better at, is learning to go off of that first point he made, is to get better at praying for other people.
Because that's part of that.
Interceding for other people.
It's part of that maturity we were talking about, to where it goes beyond yourself, to where it's like, what do you have planned for my day and my maturity and my growth, and what can I do?
Yeah. And to really pray effectively for other people obviously requires that you're in tune with the Spirit, and you're not just kind of throwing out good wishes towards people. You don't ever want that to be the case. But you really want to know what work the Spirit is doing in another's life, and then pray along those lines. That's an area I feel like I have a lot of room for growth. So yeah, again, those points that Derek Prince made are really encouraging. I'll start tonight. Start tomorrow. What do you guys think?
What do you mean?
Did you have any additional thoughts?
Oh, no, I don't think so.
All right, we'll go to our last question.
I feel like we just were answering this question right here, what we were just talking about.
Well, you guys take this question seriously, and instead of speaking mainly in
general terms.
Yeah. Just like overall principles of things, try to really apply this to where you think there is room for improvement in your spiritual. It doesn't say spiritual growth, but spiritual lifestyle. So the way that you go about things as a spiritual man. Where do you think you can grow? You need a minute to think. That's fun.
I mean, I think for me, it's definitely going back to the fruits thing. It's a lot of times it's what I'm doing with my free time. It's what I'm doing when, I'm not working or I'm not in a meeting. It's what I choose to do, and the things that I consume, and the music I listen to, and the way that I interact with others, just how I would choose to interact with them even in a familiar basis. All of that is very much a lifestyle that I live, and each decision that I make along in that lifestyle can negatively affect me or positively affect me. And even the way that I make decisions, and the way that I go about learning things, and I process the things that I learn, that's all very much a lifestyle. And in order to help myself grow healthy in the Spirit, what could I do to improve that lifestyle? And it starts with, I think, the little things, and it's really what you're consuming and what you're spending your time doing. And I think that's why these are so helpful for me, is it's in situations like this, and in meetings like this, it's another way to get positive fruits in my life, and it's another way to spend my time and further improve my lifestyle in such a way that is honoring to God, and that kind of helps me grow spiritually. But there obviously is a lot of work to be done with the way that I conduct myself and the way that I spend my time outside of moments like this. I feel like every little thing very much matters, and so focusing on that stuff can very much help.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Lord bless you. Benji, what about you?
Yeah. Yeah, a few things. Recently, as the battle with the soul continues to, have its the battles. I don't know what else to say. Just kind of the Lord has been leading me to continue to, be dead to myself and kind of at the stage of like just kind of relearning everything. Makes sense. And no longer operating in my own understanding of things. And that, in part, is also what I wanted to share next. Is just I still catch myself a lot of times in more, not as selfish, but a self-centered mindset. And the Lord has really been bringing up in my walk and through even these times just the need to understand and start to think of things in a more relational perspective, kind of like we've been talking about. And so that's been a big thing on my heart. Just there's a lot of opportunities and things that the Lord has been opening up in that array of life, I guess you could say. And so just preparing, as He prepares my heart, and as I prepare my heart, going into those deeper and more meaningful things of life, I guess, just, ridding of those perspectives. And something that you said really stood out to me is the way that I process the things that I've learned. The way that it's revealed, and the way that that I allow the Lord even to guide me for, sorry, I'm having a hard time wording things.
No, I think you're doing good.
Yeah, and how it seems very simple, and it seems like something that could be, overcome pretty easily, but how to apply those things, to life. And it's so easy, I guess, and familiar to just hear things and even think that you're living those things out, I guess, and practicing them. And even the judgment of our own selves, gets in the way of that, like thinking, am I doing this right, am I not? And the Lord has been, definitely leading me through that and showing me ways I can apply things in a living way, not just in a stagnant way, I guess you can say. That's mainly, the things. That,
Thank you. Anja?
Yeah, well, I think to myself a lot of times, like how should I be living spiritually? Because I don't think living spiritually and then not living spiritually should be two separate things. I don't think there's... If you live just as a spiritual man, if you live as one led by the Spirit, you should never not live that way. There's not really a reason not to live that way, because that's the way man was intended to live. So I think that's a struggle for everyone. And I think that's something that I think about a lot. It definitely is. It's just like, just kind of learning how to be led by the Spirit and what that even means. Because I think it just applies to everything in life at all times. So, to the biggest to the smallest. decisions and things. I think if we begin with the practical things and being led by the Spirit to make those decisions, I think there are also those in our lives. Like you have become that for us three, and Emmanuel has been that for you and us as well. People like Dad, I think, there's people that guide us and help us with that. And I think that then helps us to learn how to be led by the Spirit. Because I think a lot of people misunderstand spiritual by waving your hands in the air and being like seeing ghosts or something. It's not spiritual. Spiritual is like back to what we were talking about in the beginning. It's a understanding that there's more than just flesh and bones and thoughts. There's something. There's another dimension, like we were saying.
Mm.
I think we do many times still live in the 2D.
Mm.
So I think having a spiritual lifestyle is basically continuously living in the 3D. So.
Mm.
Yep.
Thank you for sharing. On my part, I feel like I can relate to everything y'all shared, and where I feel like I could enable myself to grow in my spiritual maturity. One thing that Isaac had mentioned was I think you said something about the way that you process your relationships in life and how you engage with different relationships and the effect and bearing that has on your spiritual growth, which comes along with an awareness of your involvement with and even responsibility over other spiritual lives. Whether that be directly or indirectly through example. That's something that is very often a burden of sorts on me, because I know that whether I desire to or am conscious of it or not, that I set an example for other people, as each one of us do. And I wrestle with wanting to walk naturally and in line with my heart and spirit, and not unnaturally in a perfectionistic way that's governed by my nitpicky intellect, which wants to see things go according to its own idea of what a good example is. I don't want to be the one that determines what the good example is. I want that to be made known by the Spirit. Even if I don't consciously know what it is, I at least want the Spirit to work through me so that I am the good example, whether I understand what it is or not. I think the Spirit does allow us to have a certain measure of understanding of what it means to be a true leader. In fact, I mean, there's some things you have to know, some things that you do and don't do, just practically speaking. And then along the lines of what something Benji shared was the way that he wants to learn how to process things that he learns. So, in other words, he really wants to learn how to learn. That's always been an intriguing subject for me, and I don't want it to remain as merely an intriguing subject. I want it to be something that I really practice and I also know it's not something that you ever stop learning. I don't think you ever stop learning how to learn. And that's a very important and relevant truth spiritually. And that's why we're ever maturing, we're ever striving for maturity. And at least in the current state of the way things are, we never reach that full, perfect state until the Lord allows that to take place within us. We really are, in some ways, we really always do fall short of that perfection, which seems like a bad thing, but it's really not, because all it does is really urge you onward. You don't plateau in what you consider to be an advanced spiritual state. Now I don't have to go any further. Rather, you're ever pursuing greater things as the Lord leads, and not for personal fulfillment or mental ascension, as it's put in other contexts, but it's you naturally are always being brought to a higher place. Mm-hmm. And then something along the lines of what Elijah had said, in the struggle that we have in kind of bouncing back and forth between operating in those two dimensions. That's definitely something I really want to be able to get past in my own spiritual walk, is having to be reminded and re-enlightened, and having to just go through that cycle of peaks and troughs of kind of feeling a little bit natural-minded today, or I feel very enlightened and spiritual today. That's that kind of double-mindedness, which is to an extent permissible for someone who's first kind of getting their bearing in what it means to walk as a spiritual man, but is not meant to be the case for someone that is to strive to greater measures of maturity. I really want to get to the place where I'm only ever in the 3D. And again, that doesn't mean that we all of a sudden are raptured and don't even exist in the natural anymore. It just means it's a new way of being in the world, but not of it. Mm-hmm. Just as a 3D person can observe and even interact with, to an extent, the 2D world, more than a 2D being even could. Imagine that. But they're not 2D, they're 3D. And yeah, I don't want to be governed by the natural anymore. So, yeah, again, thank you guys for sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, it not only almost surprises me a little bit that there's just so much in you guys, in your reflection of your own spiritual walk, that I can learn, but also enables me to understand myself a little bit better because of your thoughts about your own
I think we
spiritual
can
walk,
all
and I can apply that to my own.
And understand to each other's own.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'll pray for us and we'll wrap it up. Lord, we do thank you for this time and the opportunity that we have to lay out our hearts before one another, and but not only to present to each other what you are doing in our lives, but Lord, even to, as we were just saying, to receive from one another, and Lord, all for the benefit of the work of your Spirit within each one of us. Lord, this is truly how your Spirit both works in us and through us unto one another. Lord, I do pray that our spiritual understanding of, Lord, a truly spiritual life would ever be increasing. Lord, you of course, use life itself as a great teacher, Lord, whether it be through circumstance, Lord, through every success or every failure that we encounter in this walk and journey of life. Every part of it can be a lesson of sorts that your Spirit uses to teach us, Lord, through, Lord, the eyes and the ears that you open up within us to receive truth from another realm, Lord, that operates according to a very different sort of life than that which governs this natural realm. And so, Lord, again, even in the more practical things that we desire to do to practice living this spiritual life, Lord, may you open up the opportunities for us to do so, Lord, which, if we have the eyes to see it, you do so every day. And Lord, indeed, teach us to learn to lift one another up in times like these, and in prayer when we are apart from one another. And Lord, to learn even to be bold in living out this life, Lord, it not being something that we can only feel comfortable practicing amongst ourselves, Lord, but something that is so natural to us that we're fluent in, so to speak, Lord, that it does not matter where we are. Lord, we are ever exuding the life that is sourced in your Spirit. And Lord, I do just pray that you would continue to bless these times and the rest of this evening. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.